Hi folks, this is Sarah Marshall, your operations architect, and we are in the 14th episode of the leadership series, and this is the final episode other than the capstone, which is a review of everything that we've covered before. And this is also the second part of the culture discussion, leading via culture. And this time we're taking the infrastructure side of it. In the last episode, we talked about values and norms and how they can do heavy lifting for a leader in terms of setting the stage for expected behaviors and expected actions. The infrastructure side of things is the thing that helps us institutionalize it into the organization. And we're going to talk about the various aspects of how we can institutionalize value, or these cultural values, norms, etc., into our institutions. The idea here is that we have values and norms, and those frame the infrastructure we want to build, and we'll get into what that infrastructure is. And that in turn institutionalizes the norms and values. So as those norms and values shift, so will the framing and the infrastructure, and so it goes, and so it goes. The three types of infrastructure we're going to talk about today are governance, communications, and accelerators, and how those three support culture or help cultural shifts, or in some ways cause organizational shifts. And we'll explore those in a couple of case studies that I put together for this discussion. In the previous episode, we talked about this model of answering the questions why in life, the philosophical side. We talked about in detail in the last episode, resulting in setting up values, social norms, etc. This time we are going to talk about the scientific method side, where discovery leads to hypothesis, which leads to investigation around that hypothesis, testing, experimentation, and when it gets robust enough, it becomes theory, which leads to scientific principles that we operate by. Those result in things that we can use for infrastructure. Some of the most obvious on those hard side that evolves from scientific discovery are the things that have changed over the last 50 years. A lot of our physical infrastructure has been superseded by technical solutions, such as paper has largely been replaced by screens and workplace tools. Offices and conference rooms have largely been augmented with video conferencing and other chats and etc. Business operations of all stripes have been built into specific platforms, enterprise level platforms for companies and organizations, and filing cabinets have become data storage, etc. So this is the world we now live in, and so these are some of the tools we can use to build infrastructure. But before we get into it, let's really talk about these three aspects: governance, communications, and accelerators, and what they really mean. Governance is what it sounds like. It's the rules of the road, the policies and practices that are expected. And these often are formalized. Sometimes they are just cultural knowns in the organization. They're just known as part of the tribal requirements to fit and conform. The accelerators are things that catalyze change, that may, as they shift and as they provide new information and new understanding, they may catalyze and speed change through credibility. And we'll get into what that means, credibility, in a minute. And communications are the active driver that says, we're heading in this direction, we're changing these things, provides education, grants permission to act in a certain way, and behave in certain ways. So those are the three aspects, and let's look at some examples of that. First, we'll just start at the organizational level, the micro level, and the macro level, which is the state or the country, etc. And we want to talk about infrastructure in those terms. At the governance, of course, policies and practices. Communications is broadcasting, information, training, etc. And the executing structure, the accelerators, may come in the form of technical solutions, process performance, etc. At the macro level, it's at the micro level in organizations, it's the policies, practices, reward systems, penalties, etc. At the macro level, it's our laws and policies from the top of the food chain, so to speak, and they're managed by through our court system. Communications is coming up with a communication strategy using various channels to get information out, building training, etc. Whereas at the state and country level, it's broadcast media, social media, political speech, vision sharing. Entertainment is a big one, and I'll demonstrate that in one of the examples coming up. Accelerators in the micro level in organizations would be processes, workflows, technical platforms, etc. Whereas at the macro level, it would be service institutions like healthcare, defense, etc. Research institutions like academia and non-governmental organizations that are doing things supporting without government support or direct government support. First example I want to give is how things have shifted in terms of cultural acceptance of the LGBT community. For the accelerators, we have the medical institutions as the main one that led the charge. Political institutions in terms of the changing laws, what's been the legalization of LGBT marriage, etc. Those things have changed over the last couple of years. And the media conversation, whereas in the 50s, LGBT people were characterized as evil or ineffectual or simpering. In the current day, there is a much more robust and broad view of what LGBT arena people can be. And we're going to use as a measure or as a metric for this is public opinion over time and how the public views LGBT as an accepted part of the society. So back in the 50s and 60s, public opinion was quite negative. 70% of people saw the potential for LGBT marriage or LGBT in general as harmful. We took a slight shift in the 70s, and that was led by the medical institutions, primarily the psychiatric organizations through the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Before the 70s, being queer in any sort of way was seen as a sickness, a psychiatric sickness. In the 70s, that shifted for gay people and later for trans people, where it was taken out as a sickness and no longer treated as a sickness and treated more as helping people to fully realize themselves. And that was a critical factor of starting the shift from a negative consideration of LGBT to a more positive one. Note that that is the accelerator. It didn't in itself change the public conversation, but it did start the conversation. It did catalyze the conversation. And then we started to see in the 80s and the 90s more positive imaging of the LGBT community within movies, magazines, TV series, etc. And they became more and more positive into the 2000s and 2010s. And political institutions, which largely always follow cultural trends, started shifting and changing laws to be more supportive as well. I'm showing the 2020s as leaning back less positive, because even though there is still strong support for LGBT marriage and LGBT in general, the political climate right now is pushing against that and trying to push us back to a place we were in decades past. This is just a set of caveats down here. I had to simplify all this so I could fit it into decades, but the general structure of this is much more complex, and there's a detailed timeline you can find if you want to click into that link. Completely different kind of example of culture versus infrastructure is that the UC Berkeley campus was on the forefront of nuclear technology in terms of the nuclear physics that were used for bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer structured the first and foremost nuclear physics theoretical physics program on the UC Berkeley campus. Back in '66, there were counter-war activities, but largely the company adamantly supported the defense industry because they're still coming out of World War II and Korean War. And there was a sense that because we were in the Cold War, that it was still a serious and dangerous world, and we needed to be at the forefront of this technology that would keep us protected. We were on the heels of the Manhattan Project, and we were supporting that. So the defense complex was deeply engaged all across the country. There was tendrils in almost all the states. And the DoD was at the height of having bases just about everywhere and research facilities everywhere in the country. So this idea that we needed to keep on the forefront of this technology established a weapons research nuclear reactor on campus in Berkeley, if you can imagine. Whereas 20 years later in '86, the local culture had very much shifted to an anti-establishment, progressive movement. No longer did the country feel like it was in an existential race for its safety. It was the mid '80s were a fairly peaceful period. We weren't that engaged in a lot of conflicts around the world. And the local government in Berkeley very much legislated against continued weapons research at that point. And the last accelerator that was happening in that period was that the DoD was realigning and starting to cut back on all its bases, with 307 military closures in the mid '60s and an additional 223 in the '70s. By the time the '80s came around, it was very easy to move away from places that didn't want particular capabilities. But there was a reactor leak in 1985, which was the cherry on top of the anti-war sentiment, and the reactor was shut down, never to be seen in Berkeley again. And all that research was moved out to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory out in Livermore, California. So that's where you can see cultural shift happening, and what happens when those three things, the communications, the governance, and the accelerators working in unison to drive culture in a particular direction. So what we've learned here is that culture can do the heavy lifting for leadership, and infrastructure can do the heavy lifting for culture, in that you can get it into the institutions and use the institutions to support the culture you want to have. And it goes both ways. They can also push you away from certain cultural things as things shift. So culture dictates infrastructure, which codifies culture, and we continue with that circle. Cultural infrastructure has three aspects: governance, communications, and accelerators. Governance is the overriding policy and practices. Communications is the active driver to move things in a particular direction. And the accelerators are the underlying services and activities that help support moving things in a direction. In the two case studies, we talked about the sentiment towards LGBT community, and the UC Berkeley example of nuclear reactor, where shifts were in concert between the various aspects of infrastructure. And culture, as culture shifted, infrastructure shifted. As infrastructure shifted, culture shifted. So if you want to read more about this, you can read my article, The Culture of Power, The Power of Culture, The Power of Infrastructure. And you can find that article on my blog, www.operations-architect.com. As always, love your feedback. Feel free to reach out and give me any comments, and have a great rest of your day.